And I think we are live, but it takes a few seconds before I actually get the confirmation from YouTube and then can stop it from playing in the background, which is very annoying when I do a live stream. I don't know if there's some clever way to make it not do that, but
I see.
it is what it is. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course.
Appreciate the time here. And for our 3 listeners who may all be related to us, this is my like you and I probably said hi at various family events. You are, I guess, I call you my nephew. I think technically we're like second cousins once removed, whatever that means.
Right.
But I saw I grew up with your mom. I hadn't seen her I hadn't talked to her much in quite a while, but then she was here for a wedding last month and she sent me a link to your YouTube video about the Spider-Verse, which I found fascinating. I actually, a year or 2 ago, did a podcast with your dad discussing theology. We did like 3 or 4 episodes together about theological education. But I was really fascinated by your discussion of the Spider-Verse. There were several things that spoke to me very deeply. One is that you clearly thought a lot about narrative. And I'm my job was marketing at Apple for many years. And so narrative's a very powerful thing for me. Secondly, this channel is on exploring ways to think about human society and how we organize people together. And you talked a lot about the tension between sort of the ground level, who is this man trying to just keep the people he knows and loves alive, and even the people he doesn't know and love, his enemies. Spider-Man is noted for his compassion towards his enemy, and we can talk about some of the different movies and the way that plays out. And the tension between that and sort of a governmental authority like the Spider Society and Miguel de Icaza, who claims to be serving a greater good and must make hard sacrifices. And this tension between what I may call a local optimization morality of being good to the people I know, and a global optimization morality of trying to make the whole system stable and function is a question that I've been wrestling with in a bunch of different venues. And so that's what prompted me for here. Before I get into that, I would love to hear a little bit more about the Everything Bagel, about why you started the channel and what sort of topics and things, and also even your background. Like, there was some very subtle and interesting thinking, and I'm just curious how you came to sort of your sense of taste and the sort of problems and the issues that you tackle in your channel.
Yeah, so the Everything Bagel actually began more as, I think, what it still is, which is a creative outlet. I kind of grew up teaching myself how to make videos, and I developed a passion for storytelling and just generally analyzing and discussing stories and themes and writing. Although I haven't really done that on the channel until more recent time. So for a while, it was pretty much just existed as a bunch of short films or comedic shorts or different projects that I would work on with friends and family. And then occasionally something from maybe a film studies class in high school or college. And right now it exists as partially that. There's some recent kind of just more random comedic videos that we brainstormed up together. And then there also exists some video essays that I've been dabbling in, I guess, and slowly doing more of those. Basically talking about, I guess, mainly superhero genre stuff, although I also get into some other genres in terms of like some animation and some other movies that I had some thoughts on. I just wanted to, so I look for topics that are either, I think, interesting to a wide audience, or so like if a new Spider-Man movie comes out, I'm very passionate about the Spider-Man story, despite not having a background in comics. But I kind of like tracing how the story changes and how it's been represented in its different adaptations. And then as well, also looking at topics that I feel like haven't been discussed very much. So certain television series that I haven't really seen many videos about. I made a video about an animated show called The Dragon Prince, which is kind of in the vein of Avatar: The Last Airbender in terms of
Yeah, we watched
yeah.
like most of the first season.
Yeah, it has a slow start, but it builds up at least in the first 3 seasons to tell a really compelling narrative. Um, yeah, still waiting on future seasons to see if they can keep it going. But
Yeah. So, is it fair to say that the lens you look at this through is the lens of stories? Like you're creating stories, you're critiquing stories, you're trying to craft better stories and understand stories, and it seems like you're both sort of like a lot of your stuff is like you write skits, right? You say we. Is there do you have a partner in crime on this?
some of the more casual projects that I've worked on have involved just brainstorming with a group and throwing out ideas. Whereas a short film that I really put a lot of effort into last summer, I believe. I actually wrote out an entire script for that, and was trying to create characters, and that was more of a starting point. So if I continue with that little series in the future, I have a lot of ideas of where the themes can go and where the characters can go from there. But yes, generally, I'm looking at things through a lens of narrative and a narrative and thematic lens, and trying to see what makes a story compelling or what makes a story fail, to move the audience or to get them to engage with that piece of art. Yeah.
Okay. And is this, would you say that's partly like some people have that as a very much pragmatic goal, as they want to just make, you know, compelling art so that they make money or have an impact in the world. And some people seem to approach it more as sort of a philosophical thing. Like, I just want to understand this thing for the sake of understanding it. Do you have a more pragmatic or philosophic bent, or do you bounce back and forth?
I would say it's a little bit more philosophical than pragmatic. I like understanding stories as a way of understanding parts of the human experience, and just things that basically how stories can apply to everyone, and like how we can think about them in light of ourselves, and what those stories reveal about just shared truths and shared experiences that we all might have come to realize. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's a good segue into, you mentioned that you find the Spider-Man narratives particularly compelling. And you mentioned you didn't grow up with the Spider-Man comics. So how did you get into that, and what was it that spoke to you?
I think despite not growing up with the comics, I did grow up with a lot of Spider-Man media in terms of the Sam Raimi trilogy, and certain animated adaptations like Spectacular Spider-Man. And I think the reason I find Spider-Man so compelling is the reason everybody does, and why he's probably the world's most popular superhero at this point. And that's just because what he has to grapple with um, is just so easy for us to understand and relate to, even if we're not in a situation like he is. So kind of dealing with the core themes of Spider-Man is Peter Parker is just a kid. He didn't ask for any of this responsibility, and we kind of put ourselves in his shoes, and we're really able to understand, what if I was given this gift, but also a curse, and I have to now, to be true to myself, lay down everything I basically desire, in order to basically serve others. And I think that's a really powerful call that he has basically been, he has received. And I think it strikes a chord with everyone, because again, he's not a billionaire. He's not um, a tech genius. He's not a god. He's a person. He's a superhuman, but he's still very, very human. And I think he retains human qualities perhaps stronger than any other superhero.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. There was a short story by some famous science fiction author called The God,
Hmm.
about Superman, sitting in his chair, and he's listening to, um, a robbery taking place down the street, a child being crying, 100 miles away, right? And then he hears, and then you hear him get up and he flies away. And he goes, "Oh, Jimmy Olsen, watch out! You nearly tripped on that step there." It's like when you have godlike power, it raises this question: why don't you solve all the problems in the world? And there's a few story arcs where they kind of deal with that, where they try to, the Justice Society or a version of them tries to fix all the problems on Earth. And the more power you have when you're a billionaire and you're a god, like you have to suspend all those questions. Whereas Spider-Man, like he's a guy who had the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. My wife and I just watched the first Homecoming. And like he's like, I think I'm just gonna stay being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and just trying to deal with the stuff at this level. And that creates a certain plausibility to his psychology that is literally inconceivable for like a Superman, and even stretching credibility. I mean, Batman, you can get him game with this. He is just so tortured. He has to go around beating up people. Like okay, you can kind of make it work, but even that they play with a little bit in the Dark Knight trilogy. But I think this question. So let's take the fact that Spider-Man seems to face genuine moral dilemmas that are plausible, right? But also and this is a good segue into the Spider-Verse, because they say, well, if it's just you and you're the only Spider-Man and you're just trying to figure it all out on your own, like that's the canonical Peter Parker original Spider-Man, right? There were no other superheroes. If they were these transcendent godlike beings who would just pop in and out, but they were in a whole different plane, right? As opposed to sort of the, I guess, ultimate Spider-Man, where you've got the Nick Furies and the mentors and all the sort of thing. So to start with, Miles Morales is not traditional in that he does have a mentor. And so he's immediately thrust into this world where there's multiple Spider-Men, right? And that's interesting because that changes, the fundamental, to like me, the big thing about Spider-Man is that he has this burden that he literally cannot share with anyone.
Yeah.
Right. And that, like one of the great, and one of the first, I think, series of novels was Horatio Hornblower. He was the model for Captain Kirk. The sea captain traveling to distant worlds where he has to go ahead and make decisions, of crushing responsibility with very little information. And so he's become kind of an iconic prototype for a lot of characters. And the big thing is like, in those days when you were like a sea captain, like you had no communication, everything was on you, right? You literally had no idea. Well, a lot of the plot points were like, he's not even sure if there's a war going on or not, but he has to make a decision, and maybe he'll start a war or end a war, he's not sure which, right? And that sense of, as a literary device, the man alone making decisions is very powerful, and that's clearly the canonical original Spider-Man was very much in that. But that is not Miles Morales, right. In this, because in fact, the whole series seems to be largely about father figures, right? Whether that's Peter, the original Peter Parker who died in his dimension, the transplanted, the thick Peter Parker, as I like to think of him, whether that's his actual dad, whether that's his uncle, the villain, which I shouldn't be talking about uncles as villains here as your crazy uncle from California, but we'll let that go for the moment. And then Miles Morales, Miguel de Icazan.
Miguel O'Hara.
Miguel O'Hara, but Miguel O'Hara, who is a father figure of sorts, and certainly I, as a father, like you don't understand this, but I'm trying to keep the reality together, so I have to do something you're going to really like. I really identified with that character, and the starting point is like I have like 3 or 4 different interpretations of Miguel O'Hara as a father figure in this, because which one you think it is drastically changes like the dynamics and the tension here. And and that's what I'm most so like. One is that okay, Miguel O'Hara is just a bad guy. Like he may be an anti-hero or a plausible one, but like he had a traumatic experience and he decided he's just going to fix the world so that horrible thing doesn't ever happen again. And whether he's right or wrong and whether it's costly is mostly irrelevant. He is a man driven by compulsion that he is just doing this thing. And so like his motives and his epistemic basis is just deeply flawed and he's a pure bad guy. That's possible, but it's uninteresting. And right. The next one is that he's actually right. He is a good guy. Like he is the one holding the multiverse together. The truths that he believes are absolute eternal truths. And the cost of keeping them is always much less than the cost of breaking them, right? He is like a tragic hero, who has to do horrible things, but it's the only way the universe survives, right? Which is also somewhat plausible, but also somewhat uninteresting, right? In between, there's a couple of interesting plays. One is that he is he's a good guy who got carried away, right? He is like the Spider Society actually does legitimate work, which is good work, but he's gotten carried away, and he is quote unquote he's a good guy who is just obviously wrong in this, which seems to be the most artistically likely choice. Is that the Spider Society is not inherently evil, Miguel's not inherently evil, but he's wrong in this case, and Miles Morales is clearly right. Is to me the way. And then there's the one that is the most intriguing to me, is that maybe he was right, and maybe this is the boundary condition where being right and wrong breaks. And so anyway, those are the different hypotheses that I've been floating around with. I'm curious which of those you've considered, which ones you consider plausible.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think there's no doubt that he believes he's doing the right thing. And I think there's a pretty high probability that what he's doing is grounded in some strong evidence. There is a blank spot though, where he's making assumptions and he is limiting his basically his worldview to a certain box of what's possible. And I think part of that is due to a fear of what could happen. So I think when it comes to the sacrifices that he's making of his morality and allowing others to die to maintain this order, I think he knows there's a chance it could be a different way, but he's not willing to take that risk, whereas Miles is. And when I think it's when Gwen's character asks him, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's Gwen. She asks him for sure, do you know that this is what will happen? He does not give a clear answer. So
yeah,
he is operating on his experience with when he tried to alter things within the canon. So there is empty space that he is basically saying, I don't want to explore these possibilities. And he's basically saying, because if I don't explore those other possibilities, then I know I'm right and I know I'm safe, I guess.
Yeah, and this is great. I mean, one could make a case that Miles Morales is doing the same thing, right? That he has this morality. You protect the people you love, you protect the people close to you. And I don't want to consider the possibility that doing this will destroy an entire dimension. Right? And this is the I don't know if this is the right term. I've dabbled in philosophy and listened to a few philosophy podcasts. And I don't know if it's come up yet, but it's the epistemic problem of morality in terms of what do you know? It's like, this action could be moral if you know. A great example from the family is that your actual aunt, Nithya, was visiting. when she was, I think, in her early 20s. And my kids were like 4. My son was like 4. And so he, I mentioned that she was his oldest cousin. So no, your cousin Nithya, right? Yeah. And she's, my son's oldest second cousin. And so, they were asking me, do I have any nieces or nephews? They, well, no, your oldest cousin isn't married yet. And so she came, so my son asked her, so when are you going to get married? Which, is a horrible question to ask it, especially an Indian child. But like, he didn't know that. So it was not an immoral act for him to have done that. If I had done that, it would have been an immoral act because I knew it's like, there's a thing like, based on knowing certain facts changes the moral calculus.
Right.
And perversely, that gives you an incentive to not learn or even acknowledge certain truths so you can act morally.
Right.
And it raises this bizarre sort of almost theodical, your dad would know, like this theodicy question of like, if you know everything, can you act morally? And is it, and like there's, sort of, and what do we even mean by morality? Right? Because like I do a podcast with my dad where we are currently going through the biography of John D. Rockefeller, who is admired and reviled by different segments of society. It's very poignant for me because I consider Standard Oil kind of the first startup. And I live in Silicon Valley in the land of startups. My career is more or less involved with startups over the last 10 years. And he does a bunch of things that are objectively good for the world, like reducing the killing of whales, bringing light to millions of people in an affordable way. And many things which are today blatantly illegal and considered horribly immoral, like collusions, cabals, sort of blackmailing people into selling their businesses and things like this, that he considered perfectly moral and a God-given mandate to do. Very much a let's call it an imperial figure, right? Someone who imposes order on a chaotic system in line with certain principles. And, as I've been, I grew up, my trilogy I grew up in was Star Wars. That was, the cutting edge special effects, bringing fantasies to life in a real way. And because of that, and, 1976, and Ronald Reagan, like being anti-imperial was kind of in my blood. As I've gotten older, I've realized, well, it's not quite that cut and dry, being Indian, like the British Empire was horribly oppressive and exploitive in a lot of ways. But by any measure I care about, it was way better than what preceded it. The Hindu kingdoms that ruled India before that, or even the corporate overlords of the Dutch East India Company. And during COVID, it really struck me, civilization sucks in a lot of ways, but it's vastly preferable to the alternative.
Yeah.
And having a John D. Rockefeller to impose order and ensure that the trains run on time and that the store shelves are stocked. Like, I hate to say it, but I would gladly take that bargain, over the alternative, even if it includes horrible cruelty and oppression and slavery and exploitation and all these ugly things. Because like, I'm not willing to destroy all of civilization to have that level of it. Because, you go back to an anarchic agrarian state and then someone's going to build another empire again for very logical reasons. Because you don't want to keep getting raided all the time. You don't want to have random incursions, to use the multiverse term, that destroy your reality. It's like, well, if you don't, because like, and so that was probably more of a confession than a question. But I think this is the problems of the Miguel O'Hara. I don't know why I have the wrong name for him. Or maybe there's a different superhero somewhere I got stuck on, or maybe that's the guy who built the .NET mono framework. Anyway, a interloper who built an ecosystem that he tried to impose order on. I'm not sure. The question is, and I think this is maybe this is what they're going to answer. Like, well, I think that's what you're saying, right? Is how badly did Miguel O'Hara over-index on his own trauma? Right? Was he like, there's a case to be made that like, okay, he screwed up because he selfishly chose to take a spot and break canon in somebody else's timeline. That was clearly horrible. And, you know, we know, at least from the multiverse of madness, is that other things can create incursions. We don't know if canon events, well, I guess we know from the What If animated series, I assume you've seen that.
Yeah.
Is that there are certain absolute events that if you violate them, destroy your reality. Like the death of Christine in the alternate Doctor Strange.
Right.
His universe is right. So there's at least plausible evidence that there's absolute events that if you break them, destroy your reality. And there's at least a plausible connection between absolute events and some canon events. Right? And so if that's the case, then, you know, it could be that Miguel is right at that epistemic level, that canon events threaten our reality. And actually, you may remember better than I did, when there's a scene in India with my cousin, Pavita Prabhakar.
Yeah.
My dad likes to say it's supposed to have been Pradeep Prabhakar, which is my brother's name.
Yeah.
But after he breaks the canon, is there an incursion? Is there a multidimensional being that gets summoned, or is that just Spot wreaking havoc like Spot usually does?
Right. That's a good question. I think I've thought about Spider-Verse outside of what the MCU has done in terms of multiverse. So there is a separation for me there, because I think the creative team is not. It's definitely referencing it and kind of as an Easter egg, I think, but I don't know if it's trying to participate in the MCU and its multiverse. So that's just one clarification I would make for myself personally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess.
I mean, first of all, like, was there an incursion after Miles saved Pavita's girlfriend's dad?
Yes, there was something. So there was.
Which was not Spot. There was something other than Spot that was causing a disruption.
It's interesting because it took the appearance of Spot's powers, I think, in some ways, but that's a question of, is Spot's powers just related to tearing holes in different universes? And so we don't know exactly the details of what caused it. But I think one interesting thing is that what really counts as a canon event and how are they determined? Because I think it's for Earth 42. It never got its Spider-Man, yet the universe is still whole. It's under a lot of turmoil, but that universe is still seemingly perfectly fine. And so
the fabric of reality at least is not damaged, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
and so that's the interesting thing. So here's a plausible hypothesis. There is such a thing as canon events. But either, and then let's just use the term absolute events to refer to the idea that this thing, if you break it, reality gets shredded, right? Yeah. And maybe so like one possible hypothesis is that there are canon events, and some canon events are absolute events and some are not, right? At least because Miguel O'Hara's definition of a canon event, right, is an absolute event, but maybe there are canon events which are absolute events, and his definition of canon is what's wrong, or his ability, or maybe his definition is, conceptually is correct, but practically it's wrong. I don't know, right? Like, but there's an emphasis. The other possibility is that canon events are not absolute events, but they can lead to absolute events, right? And that there's some other conditions upon them, right? And like, to me, this would be the most interesting thing, is if that, and now the implication of the story is that there was a canon event that happened in Paviter's universe. It was thwarted by Miles, and because of that, Miles' father would die. Is that your interpretation as well, or would you just see that differently? Like, was Miles' father always going to die, or is it because he did this thing with Paviter?
No, I think Miles' father was always going to die.
Okay.
I think according to their calculations and their framework of seeing like, oh, the police captain, every Spider-Man story we have recorded in our system, this is how this story goes.
First you lose someone close to you, a father figure, and then after that a police captain.
Yes. So I don't think that's related to Miles' intervention. I think what happened in Mumbattan was more of a warning to Miles, like, and evidence that that Miguel uses against him, and saying this is what's going to happen if you also try to save your father, because then at that point, your universe may also collapse, or we may also have these problems. I think that's what is trying to be communicated, and I do expect to get more clarification in the final chapter. So
yeah, and a resolution, hopefully.
Hopefully,
the question and of the if not,
yeah.
it'll be even more fodder for channels like yours to speculate.
Yeah, but I think what we know now, I honestly, part of me definitely, I think, believes that Miguel is right about, based on what we've seen. So unless
his beliefs are plausible.
Yeah, so I think he may even be making a correct logical deduction about not intervening in these things because they can cause massive damage and lead to even more lives lost. But I think he's immoral because he's not trying to find a solution to it, but rather accepting it. So it's a strange situation, because I think he might be taking the correct, maybe ethical course of action or moral course of action. But I think it becomes immoral when he stops searching for an alternative.
Yeah, so this is the idea that fossilized morality becomes immoral. Right.
Yes,
but there's also the there's this wonderful quantity in physics, which is energy time, which is energy times time. It's called action, or it's kind of a tuple. And one of the things you realize is that actually the amount of action available to you determines your morality, right? If I'm walking down the street and someone's trying to kill somebody, like, I gotta just call somebody or walk away. But if you're Spider-Man and you see that happening, because you have a valid action you can take, therefore you have an obligation to do something about it, right? And one of the interesting things is that there's a psychological, physical component to, like, what is a valid action, right?
Yeah.
And what is even a conceivable action. And one can make the case for Miguel O'Hara is like, okay, he has done literally everything he can think of to solve the problem of incursions and canon events, right? Recruiting this massive spider society across all the known multiverses. And in order to do that, he had to believe it was possible and worthwhile.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I run into a lot in my various endeavors is precisely that the level of belief required to do this, let's call it empire building, right, seems to psychologically precondition you or even require you to not question your foundational assumptions.
Yeah.
Right? Is that, in order, like, he could not have done that Herculean effort if he had the smallest shred of doubt that he was right. Because otherwise it just gets too damn hard. Sorry, one expletive. I allow myself one expletive per conversation. And it's really, and this is the tragedy, is that, what is the old saying? Die a hero or live long, become a villain.
Yeah.
Because you almost have to believe something that is almost true to do any good in the world, given our finite minds. But then that subtle lie becomes your undoing. And yet it is precisely the thing you cannot see. And Miles as you know, the black man in this story represents sort of the other reality where all the angst and the externalities that the empire doesn't want to deal with get dumped on.
Mm.
And you know, in some sense, one can argue you could make a strong case that as the person who's trying to protect reality, it is plausible that Miguel is operating more within the epistemic reality accessible to him, just as Miles is operating morally in the epistemic reality available to him. And that instance is actually the best possible story, is that like, by any plausibly viable morality, both of them are doing the right thing. And that's actually the best kind of story, right? Where they're both doing right. And then the question is that like, okay, is there a higher implausible morality that they should be called to? And this is actually the thing that very personally I'm grappling with, which is, you know, your mom was lamenting, he's reading all these great stories, but like nothing have anything to do with God or, you know, religion or like the stuff that she considers really important. And like, it's like, no, this is much better, because this way you get to ask these questions in a way that is much more difficult to do in those traditional frameworks. Because like, you know, is there something more important than preserving all of reality? Is there something more important than acting ethically towards the people you love? And if so, because like, if that's not the case, then it's really hard to judge either of them, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
you know, but if there is, then it's like, what is this higher thing? Because like, there's a very good chance if, you know, Miguel started asking that question, like, is there something more, he would cease to function and that the whole system would fall apart. I thought about this often as a dad, you know, especially when my kids were little. It's like, if I start questioning whether I can do this, whether it's worth doing, you know, because there's a lot of work, not just the physical work of keeping the kids alive, but the psychological work of trying to like discipline them and train them and set standards and rules. And, you know, we have lots of examples of failure modes where dads decide they can't do it and bail, or they decide they don't know anything and they just kind of give up, right? And, you know, I'm sure you've probably had conflicts with your dad and your mom about morality. And I'm sure they didn't get them all right, but I think you would probably agree you're better for having had those conflicts.
Yeah, and I think the way that this applies to the conversation here with Miles and Miguel both seemingly making moral and ethical decisions based on what they know and their experiences, and that being like part of what it means to be Spider-Man, right? Bearing that burden, and then having to live that. I think that works to some extent on an individual level, where if you have an action you need to take and basically calling yourself higher to that responsibility, I think that makes sense. But I think the main difference between them is that who are they trying to impose their morality and ethics on? Because where Miles is basically asking for the Spider Society to allow him to do what he believes is right, Miguel is imposing his morals on an entire society, and to some extent the entire multiverse, where he is imposing what he believes to be right. He's taking that individual Spider-Man like sense of morals, but then imposing it on a way greater scale, which becomes almost a dictatorship.
Let's call it, it's an empire.
Sure.
He's setting apart, right? And like, but this is the problem: is that the inverse possibility is that Miles is imposing his consequences on his and potentially multiple realities, right? So if he acts out in a way that is actually, you know, destroys an absolute event, right? Then all those realities are toast by definition, right? And you know, and I think the thing that's interesting, Miguel, it's like there is a difference between let's use the I think this is actually the philosophical terms, but so Nietzsche talks about slave morality. When you're a slave, you have no responsibility or consequences on the larger system. It's like you love your neighbor, you be good to those around you, and everything else is totally outside your control, right? And then there's, let's call it, I guess, imperial morality, which is that if you're like, what is moral for if imperial for an emperor is like you keep the empire together and more or less functioning. Like if you destroy the empire, corrupt it or delegitimize it so everything degenerates into chaos, that's immoral. And your personal morality is possibly secondary to that, right? I mean, like I said, this is like in civilization, like I don't care if the store manager is a horrible, evil jerk who abuses his wife and children and cheats on his taxes. If I've got groceries and I can feed my family, I will pay him and honor him for it. And I don't like that fact. It's a really ugly fact, but I can't get away from that. It's like to have civilization requires people who are essentially subscribing to imperial morality. You got to keep the system running, or none of the other questions even matter. And I would argue that this is so I think we can only judge like Miguel by imperial morality, or at least we have to at least judge him by that.
Okay.
Right? Like if his imperial morality is flawed, like he actually doesn't need to do this. He's just reacting. There are no absolute events, or they're not at all correlated with canon events. Then he's just deluded. Right?
Yeah.
But if he's right that there are canon events which are sometimes absolute events, or then I feel like we have to judge him by his imperial morality, at least that.
Yeah, I think my main gripe is that I feel like when you're trying to design or at least uncover an ethical system by which we live that affects other people, it cannot be done individually. Like ethics can only be done within a community, and I think that's the only way they can be ethical. So I think because his empirical morality and his empirical system of this, it's not really a society, right? It's an empire. And so that even that terminology is almost propaganda for.
Well, to be fair, though, it is sort of a secret society that is acting like imperial overlords over the universe.
Yeah, but I feel like it's mainly just an extension of Miguel. I think
but that's a very good point. So you're right, is that people can question him, but yeah, and it is imperial. I mean, I guess society. I guess there are, not all society, maybe in the generic sense, not in where we tend to use it now, where it's more of an association.
Yeah, because there's no discussion or collaboration happening to inform this ethical system that Miguel is.
There is, but he definitely retains the paternalistic. I make the final decision. You can question me, you can challenge me, but I make the final decision, right? Because they do question and challenge him. Like, are you sure? Like, we talked about this. Like they're all aware of this. They're not blindsided. They're not blindly following orders. They are like good children. They argue and they fight with their parent, and then the parent makes the decision and they live with it.
Yeah, but even the father in a healthy system has peers and an equal in the form of, well, in a healthy household, like a partner, a wife. And so a healthy household never has one person that is deciding everything on their own, because ideally.
But here's the question: are there certain decisions? We could do this with your dad sometimes. Like we're like, you feel like, okay, we discuss everything, we talk through everything, we try to make a consensus decision wherever possible. But at least in the traditional, 1980s style Christian home, I don't know how your dad functions today, and I'm not even sure how I function today. That's a whole different discussion.
Right.
But like, if there's a big decision and you can't reach a consensus and it's urgent, the man makes the decision.
To some extent, I'd say that has been my experience, yeah.
And I think that's what I would argue, a plausible case, that's what Miguel is doing here. Like he tries to discuss everything. It's like, well, okay, you know, we've talked about this. I understand this, and there's some uncertainty. Like, darn it! Like, if this doesn't happen now, there's a very good chance we're going to lose reality. I'm making the call. We have to do this.
Mm.
You know, and you know, there's a level of emotion and friction, whatever. But like, it's certainly not a spur of the moment thing. It's certainly like it's very clear that you know they knew this would happen, and he said like if we can keep them from doing this, then like this raises the question like what was the discussion they had, and why did it matter that Miles saved the police captain? Was it that he showed that he was willing to violate canon? Was that what made it the thing where they had to lock him up so he wouldn't go back? Was that the thing that Miguel was watching for that triggered the I'm going to lock you up?
No, I don't think so. I think because Miles didn't know what that would do, they gave him the benefit of the doubt and gave him a chance to kind of join their ideology that they
But
had
like
already.
the specific like Gwen was saying like don't save that
Yeah, but
child, don't
he
save the
didn't
kid.
have the context. He didn't have the context.
Miles
So
didn't. But
right, he thought he
what
was
context
just.
did Gwen give? What was why was Gwen worried about him doing that act?
She knew that okay, so she had been informed that it was a canon event and that he was going to die, or he was supposed to die.
Yes.
She told Miles not to save him. Miles interpreted that as her being afraid for Miles's safety, but he took the risk anyways. So he didn't know that he was going against the canon when he saved Inspector Singh. But later he was informed
Against his immediate physical safety as opposed to his freedom.
Yeah. So, but when he broke canon, the first time he didn't know he was doing that.
Right, but that was the thing that in Gwen's eyes she was trying to protect him from.
She was trying
canon.
to. Yeah, I don't think she was concerned for his safety. She was trying to protect reality by telling him.
No. So my understanding is that she was actually worried for Miles. Is that she said is that I was worried about, is that that the way he did that crossed some threshold in Miguel's mind. That once he did that, before that they could have let him go, but after that Miguel had to lock him up, and everything seemed to change. That seemed like what was triggering Gwen.
I would disagree because I don't think they locked up Miles until he demonstrated a willing defiance of their system. Because I don't think they were going to lock him up for something he didn't realize he did. But they took the time and they walked him through headquarters and they like talked to him about what's going on. They told him about the canon, and it was only once he denied their ideology and their perspective and said that this is not how he wanted to do things and he ran, that's when they tried to lock him up. So they gave him a chance to conform, but he chose not to, and that is that's the point in which they decide he is a liability.
I feel like there was something that happened. Maybe I'll rewatch it again and see there, but certainly you're right. It played out that way, and they did definitely try to find an alternate, and then when they couldn't, then Miguel made the hard call. And it's an interesting question of under what reality is it psychologically plausible that Miguel could have made a different call? Like, what would he have had to believe the nature of reality? And the best idea that I've come up with so far is discussing with my mentor on Wednesday, is that every system has a flaw at its center, like a partial truth or a near truth. And just admitting the fact that everything you build has that flaw. Mm-hmm. And it's easier to build if you deny that. If you just believe like this is the beautiful thing that will fix everything, therefore it's worth this insane Herculean struggle. But the alternative to say like, yeah, this is what it means to be human, is that I'm going to build the system knowing it's flawed, knowing it's going to create enormous injustice and cruelty and have these horrible second order consequences, but it is the only thing I can do to save reality as I know it. But to own the flaw and cherish it and say, I just have to believe that someday, somehow, there will be a way to redeem this. And
Right.
to keep that hole open, and to live with the tension that staying aware of that flaw will make me less effective at building this good system. But finding enough strength and grace for myself to do so, and yet letting a little piece of me stay hungry and stay curious, so that when I hit an anomaly, what my mentor and I talked about is you have system A, which is the formal system you're building to try and solve a problem. But then you keep the shadow system A prime in place to track all the exceptions, all the things that don't fit. And you have that sort of running in the background. And then every now and then you look and see, okay, maybe we need a system B that will transcend both system A and A prime, kind of the Hegelian dialectic, if you will. And for me, the way that I've tried to put this into practice is that I have sort of my model of reality and the things I believe in. And, these are how I plan my life and guide my actions. You can use words like religion or spirituality, or, faith or whatever in that. Though it can be much more pedestrian than those. But then there's a countervailing moral demand, which is to try to be fully present and empathize and comprehend where other people are coming from.
The very Bonhoefferian.
Yeah. And and realizing that when I am dealing with you, and this is what I'm trying to get to with my son, he's 14, right at that 15. God, I keep saying 14. He's been 15 since April, and it's still hard. Is like, I just need to be present with him in his reality and comprehend him and be articulate about this. And then sometimes we're trying to say, okay, we've had this conversation. I think I've heard you. I hope you feel heard. And sometimes I can let it stop there. And sometimes I can say, okay, we've had this conversation. I have to make a decision as a dad that we're going to do X. And we don't have enough time to go any further, and I'm sorry. And there is a karmic debt I incur every time I have to make one of those calls. And they compound, right, in terms of his trust in me, in terms of my empathy for him. And I have to acknowledge, yeah, this is what it means to be a dad, is to make these hard calls when there's no good answer, there's just lesser evils. And to be a modern dad, and maybe even to be a Christian dad, is different from a classical dad in that you have to own the karmic debt as opposed to externalizing it onto somebody else and saying, well, that's just the way it is. If you don't like it, that's your problem, right? Which was very much the canonical 1950s father, and even what people sometimes mean when they mean by biblical fatherhood, which makes it interesting and awkward. And so, yeah, so this is why Miguel is the character I identified most with in this saga. And that's why I am desperately hoping for his redemption, desperately hoping that he was not completely deluded. He was actually legitimate. And the best case scenario is that Miles is an anomaly that literally opens up a whole new reality that was actually inaccessible to Miguel. Literally, there was nothing he could have done to have achieved that higher level of reality to comprehend an alternative to canon events. That all the horrible sacrifices he made were actually necessary. That's the best case scenario for me. It's like the Jewish system of sacrifices or the Pharisee. It's apart from Christ, there was literally nothing better they could do. Yeah. That was the only option they had was to either do horrible things to preserve society or give up and let society fall apart.
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. I think there's definitely, Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, I think, potentially. And I think there are just a few things, few hangups that I have with the analogy of Miguel as the father figure making the hard call. And I think that just has to do with, I think if he is that father figure, he's not a very good one.
Well,
Because I
here's the
think
interesting question. Yeah.
his I just think that's because, well, one, there's a very heavily implied level of hypocrisy in his own character and how he interacts with Miles, because I think part of this may be coming from just traditional Spider-Man history and like there's just the lore of the franchise, and also it's a little bit implied because of how his character is introduced. Out of all the characters that they give the introduction of like, my name is Miles Morales and this is how I became Spider-Man. I was bit by a radioactive spider.
Yeah. Yeah.
There, that's entirely absent for Miguel, and his accusation of Miles as an anomaly is starting to seem a little bit of some irony there, because we don't know if he's actually a version of Spider-Man.
Yeah. Well, one could argue Miguel O'Hara is also an anomaly.
Yeah, and then the one last thing is that a good father figure makes these decisions out of a humility and a servanthood mindset. For like, at least in scripture it says that the husband has this responsibility in terms of what Paul is saying, but but it's because he must love, like love his family or love his wife like Christ loved the church, which is a laying down of one's life. And I don't know if Miguel's mindset really exemplifies a healthy father decision maker mentality in the slightest. How much of it is pride? How much of it is based on his own guilt and his own ideology and his mission, you know? And how much of it is self-serving?
So this is a great question. I could make a case that there's two kinds of good father. There's two different definitions of good father, which is one of the paradoxes of being a dad. One is, are you preparing your children for the world that they live in? And then the second is, do you have a good relationship with your children? And what I remember, this came to a head with me when my son was, I think, in fourth grade, and he had he had failed to memorize his Bible verse for Christian school, and we were like panicking trying to get his Bible verse memorized in order to make it to school, and I was like pressuring him all this, and it's like, and the horrible thing, the verse was like, do not be anxious about anything. So I was definitely getting really twisted. I was like, wait, what is my responsibility here? Is my responsibility to make sure that my son does the homework that the school told him he's supposed to do and train him in the world that, like, of course you must do your homework, you know? Is my responsibility to let myself know that I love him unconditionally? Is my responsibility to actually obey the scripture and model the thing that I'm telling him to do instead? But like, literally, if I tried to actually live out and model all the scriptures that I believe are true, I would probably, destroy my church from the inside out. If I actually like made that my top priority to try to authentically live out scriptures as I understand them, rather than go along with what the pastor is preaching, what the Bible teachers are saying, because like, if you question everything, I've done this. If you question everything all the time, you become a jerk that no one listens to and nothing gets done. You don't either create change or help the system function. And like, the more I know, the more complicated epistemic morality becomes, because I see the corruption in the world as it is. Mm-hmm. And I say, like, now I am knowingly complicit in the system as opposed to innocently going along with it. And the more I tell my son about that, the more he becomes complicit rather than innocent. Is that good or bad? Or at which age is that appropriate? And this is why I feel like, given Miguel's understanding of reality, like, maybe that is actually being humble. Like, I don't know which canon events are going to destroy reality. I have to be epistemically humble, and I have to try to protect as many realities as I can, and that's servanthood. And the reality Miguel, that's the best father he can be, which sucks. And yet it's true. And at least to me, that's what I feel like.
Mm.
is like, yeah, I'm not a, and like, and the question is, what is a good father like? I'll close on this one, which is, I had to give a Father's Day sermon at church, which is always awkward. People love doing the Mother's Day sermons. I kind of despise them, but that's a whole different story for another reason. Well, the short answer is actually precisely this: is they idolize unconditional acceptance, which is what mothers represent. But unconditional acceptance is not the same as unconditional love.
Yes. Yeah.
It's closely related, and it's not easy to distinguish, which is probably why it irritates me that I can't articulate it clearly enough. But partly this precisely what it means to be a father is like arguably, if a motherhood is unconditional acceptance, fatherhood is unconditional service. Like, at least when I was growing up, if you had to be a man and travel to the other side of the world and work to send home money to feed your family, you would do it, even if it cost you your family's relationship. That's what a good, as opposed to sitting around being unemployed. Whatever you have to do to provide for your family is worth it. And maybe that's not a great trade-off, but it was still an honorable one, because like, to sit there in a place where there's no jobs and your family starves to death is not being a good father, right? And if your children grow up in a world of aristocrats, where if they mouth off to an aristocrat, they will be whipped to death and their whole family will be killed, then training your children, however harshly, to be subservient to aristocrats is healthy, is the right thing to do, because otherwise they will not survive.
I just don't know if Miguel has the same level of self-awareness that you view yourself with, because
well, here's the tragedy, though.
It's like there's a lot of denial within his own, the way he presents himself. So.
And what I have discovered is that self-awareness is a curse. It's like being Spider-Man. It's a gift and a curse, and not everyone can handle it. And the trade-offs I make by pursuing self-awareness, I am not sure I would wish on most people, because most people quite literally, like I've discovered quite painfully, there are certain truths that if you knew them, you would cease to be able to function.
Yeah.
Like, and it is, and you know, I can pity him for his lack of self-awareness, but I cannot condemn him for it. Because if he had this self-awareness, he would probably have just curled up and died after he destroyed an encouraged reality. And he found a near way that let him function.
Yeah.
And he is a Pharisee. You know, and in fact, the reason he probably despises and is so angry at Miles is because he is the opposite anomaly of Miles. He is precisely an anomaly. And we always have the least grace for the people whose sin reminds us of our own. And that is a fascinating question, maybe to leave it with, is like, where is there grace for Miguel? Where is there grace for Miles? And are they the same? And will we find either of those in, because like, you know, Miles seems to be very self-righteously, I'm going to save my dad. But then instead he's thrust in this place where he's literally confronted with his dark side. And I feel like Miles is not going to get a simple answer.
Yeah.
You may get a profound answer, but he won't. I don't think it's going to be simple.
I sure hope it's not simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in closing, I think like maybe it is a really good allegory to explore two different systems of ethics, where at least from some stuff I've studied a little bit, reading Stanley Hauerwas, who is a pacifist, and reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is, I guess, activist, what you would call pro-responsibility ethicist, where he's engaging with the world as he knows it and accepting the fact he will bear the burden of making those either mistakes or having to potentially being called to bear the weight of sin in order to love the world and care and see change, where Hauerwas is saying, no, there's another way. If we limit our vision to what we see around us, then we can never be what Christ is calling the church to be. So it's an interesting analogy, and it's that age-old, that age-old debate between, are we trying to be responsible and realistic, or are we trying to be greater? Are we trying to reach a higher calling and at the risk of seemingly allowing the world around us to deteriorate at a faster rate. So it's impossible. It's hard.
I think realism versus idealism is probably the more canonical.
And what is the Christian
way
to do things? It's
and I think that one could argue that Christ on the cross is precisely this collision of opposites.
Yeah.
You know, holy and sinful, God and man, life and death. And it is very, I guess, Kierkegaardian in that sense. It is this thing that transcends our traditional definitions of morality. Yeah. And it is only by embracing that flaw at the heart of our system of morality that we can both act morally in the present and yet grow morally in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that tension is there. So anyway, this has been fascinating.
I
hope it worked well for you. We definitely have to do this after the next one comes out. And
yes,
if something comes up, I may even trigger you to have another of these conversations before. But it's been wonderful to get to know you, Cadence, and to have this conversation with my nephew.
Likewise.
And it intersects in odd, interesting ways with the conversations I've had with your dad and your mom and other things going on. I will send this to my son. I think he's unlikely to watch it, but I'll at least send him your first Spider-Verse thing, which is well produced enough. He may tickle his fancy. And then I try to drag him out for coffee once a month and have a conversation. So I'll see if I can at least have a parallel one with him. And stay in touch.
Yeah, will do.
All right.